In the quiet space between waking and dreaming, there are names that still drift through the dark like distant stars, glowing softly, refusing to fade. Tonight, one of those names moves gently toward us on the slow breath of history. Leonardo, a man born beneath simple skies, who learned to listen to the secret language of the world. He watched birds and imagined flight. He traced human muscles as if reading sacred maps. He painted shadows so alive they seemed to breathe. His was not a life of loud conquest, but of patient wonder. And as the night deepens around us, his story unfolds not in flashes of noise, but in a calm river of curiosity, devotion, and quiet genius. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side as the night drifts on. You can gently like the story, and drift along with us again whenever you need rest wrapped in history. There is no rush here, only the slow and steady company of the past, walking softly beside you. In the earliest hush of morning, before the village stirred and before the roosters dared to speak, a small boy often lay awake beneath a simple roof of wood and clay, listening to the breath of the world. The hills outside Vinci rolled softly like sleeping animals, and the air carried the scent of soil and olive leaves. This was where Leonardo began, not in marble halls or gilded chambers, but in the quiet cradle of the countryside, where nothing shouted and everything whispered. From his first days, he seemed to belong more to the wind and water than to the rigid lines of human rule. He watched the way mist lifted from the fields at dawn, how it blurred the edges of the world and made everything feel possible. He was born out of simple beginnings, the child of a notary and a peasant woman, belonging fully to neither world. This quiet distance, this gentle in-between, would follow him all his life. He was not trapped by expectation in the way other boys were, and so he wandered, through groves of fig and oak, along narrow streams that cut silver paths through stone. He walked with open eyes and an open mind. His grandmother's voice was often the only sound in the evenings, telling stories softened by time. But during the day, nature was his truest teacher. The flight of birds carved questions into his thoughts. The movement of water over rock taught him patience without words. And in those small moments, curiosity took root like a seed pressed deep into warm earth. Other children learned trades. Leonardo learned how shadows leaned across walls as the sun slid west. He learned that every shape held another hidden inside it. He learned that stillness was never truly still. When insects rested on leaves, he studied their fragile wings with breath held tight, as if afraid the smallest movement might break a secret spell. At night, the stars became distant fires he longed to understand, not as symbols of fate, but as questions written across the dark. There was no single moment when genius awakened in him. It arrived quietly in countless small glances, in the gentle slope of a hillside, in the twist of roots beneath soil, in the way smoke from a hearth did not simply rise, but danced, curled, and vanished as if it had never been. And each night, as the village settled into sleep, the boy lay awake again, his thoughts drifting farther than his body ever could. As years passed, his hand began to reflect the quiet hunger of his mind. He drew not for praise, but for understanding. Scraps of charcoal traced animals on stone and wood. Faces took shape from memory alone. He captured movement as if trying to hold time still, just for a breath. His father noticed, though he did not yet see destiny. He saw talent, yes, but talent was common. What he did not yet understand was the depth of the silence behind Leonardo's eyes, the depth from which these drawings rose. And so one day, those drawings were carried beyond the village, placed gently into the hands of a master in Florence. It was the first ripple that would become a wave across centuries. But for Leonardo, it was simply another threshold. He was still only a boy walking forward with a heart full of questions. Florence awaited him like a living dream carved from stone and sound. The city shimmered with voices, with hammer strikes and flowing pigment, with rivalry and ambition braided tightly together. For a boy raised among fields and streams, it was overwhelming and thrilling at once. Towers reached upward as if trying to touch the same heavens he had stared at from quiet hills. The streets carried the sense of paint, metal, sweat, and possibility. And somewhere within that vast living body of a city, Leonardo stepped into the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. Here, discipline met imagination. Here, beauty was no longer an accident of nature, but something built stroke by careful stroke. The young apprentice learned how to grind pigment, how to stretch canvas, how to prepare the surface before a single line could be drawn. These were slow lessons, patient lessons, and Leonardo learned them well. Yet even as he followed instruction, his eyes searched beyond it. He did not simply copy form. He asked what lay beneath form. He did not just learn how to draw a hand. He wondered how bone and tendon worked together to make motion sing. The workshop buzzed with the energy of youth and ambition, yet Leonardo moved through it quietly, absorbing more than he spoke. When others boasted of their progress, he lingered at the edges, watching light trace the curve of a cheek, watching emotion soften a mouth into half a smile. Even then, long before the world would give it a name, the smile that would one day haunt generations was already forming in his imagination. At night, Florence dimmed, but Leonardo did not. By the low flame of candlelight, he drew what no one had asked him to draw. Strange machines of wood and cloth, spirals of water in motion, muscles layered like maps beneath skin. The world he was given during the day was not enough. The world he made at night kept calling him forward. And yet, with all this wonder growing inside him, there was also a quiet weight he carried without complaint. He was still the boy born between worlds, legitimate enough to rise, yet always slightly apart. It shaped him into an observer more than a participant. While others chased reputation, Leonardo chased patterns. While others sought approval, he sought truth. And in this quiet difference, his path continued to unfold. As the seasons turned and his skill outgrew his youth, Florence began to notice the strange calm radiance in his work. There was something alive inside his figures that others could not quite achieve. They did not merely stand upon the surface of the world. They seemed to breathe within it. Yet for Leonardo, each finished piece felt incomplete. Every answer opened into another question. Every painting pointed toward another unseen layer waiting to be understood. And so, as the city slept and the moon moved silently above tiled roofs, Leonardo's journey continued forward in thought long before it would move forward in fame. The boy who once listened to the wind now listened to the heartbeat of a city. And the questions only grew deeper. And so, as the night deepened around him, the quiet search moved gently onward, toward discoveries not yet imagined, and shadows not yet understood. The days in Florence moved with their own restless rhythm, like a river that never truly slept. Bells marked the hours, merchants shouted beneath striped awnings, and the Arno slid past stone banks with quiet indifference to human dreams. Within this living pulse, Leonardo continued to grow, slowly, inwardly, as if his true education unfolded beneath the surface of what others could see. He learned to mix colors until they carried the softness of skin and the depth of shadow. He learned how light did not merely fall upon objects, but entered them, shaped them, and gave them their quiet voice. Yet what he learned with the greatest devotion was how to wait. While other apprentices hurried toward completion, eager for praise, Leonardo lingered. He would stare at a face for hours before lifting his hand. He would study how breath moved the chest before sketching a single line. To some, this looked like hesitation. To him, it was listening. He waited until the subject revealed itself, until the hidden curve beneath the obvious shape rose into clarity. And when he finally drew, the line carried a calm certainty that felt like truth rather than effort. In Verrocchio's workshop, there came a day when master and student met upon the same canvas. It was a painting of a sacred scene, filled with figures shaped by discipline and tradition. Leonardo was asked to paint a single angel. Only one, a small corner of the whole. Yet when the paint dried and the figures stood together in stillness, something impossible had happened. The angel Leonardo painted did not look like it belonged to the same world as the others. Its softness, its presence, its quiet life seemed to awaken the rest of the scene into deeper reality. The story would later be told that Verrocchio laid down his brush that day, humbled by the touch of his student. Whether true or softened by time, the meaning remained the same. Leonardo had crossed an invisible threshold. He was no longer only learning. He was becoming. Yet with growth came restlessness. Florence praised him, but it also constrained him. Patrons wanted familiar beauty. Churches wanted certainty in color and form. Leonardo's mind, however, kept drifting beyond the visible. He wished to know how clouds shape themselves in the sky. He wished to follow the path of birds across valleys and learn the secret grammar of wings. The more the city applauded, the more he felt the pull of paths not yet taken. Inside him, questions pressed gently but relentlessly, like waves against a hidden shore. There were evenings when he walked alone along the riverbank, watching reflections tremble in broken mirrors on the water's surface. The faces in the ripples were distorted, yet somehow more truthful. He saw that nothing in the world remained fixed, not even stone. Everything flowed, everything changed. And if everything changed, then to understand life, one must understand movement. This thought settled into him like an ember that would never fully cool. Soon, the quiet murmur of opportunity called from beyond Florence. Milan, a city heavier with power and shadow, beckoned. Its ruler wanted more than beauty. He wanted spectacle, strength, and invention. Leonardo gathered his notebooks, filled with drawings of wings and gears and unspoken dreams, and traveled north. The road carried him away from the warmth of youth into a sharper, colder light. Yet, as always, he moved forward not with fear, but with attentive calm. Milan unfolded before him with towering fortresses and wide echoing halls where footsteps seemed to linger longer than voices. Here, ambition wore armor. Leonardo offered not just the hand of a painter, but the mind of an engineer, the vision of a dreamer. He spoke of bridges that could rise and fall like breath, of machines that could defend cities, of devices that could one day lift humans into the sky. The Duke listened, the court watched, and Leonardo was welcomed into a world where imagination was currency. By day, he painted the faces of power. By night, he opened his notebooks and let wonders spill across the pages. Designs of flying machines rested beside sketches of skulls and hearts. Rivers curled through diagrams like living veins. There was no separation in his mind between flesh and machine, between art and science. Everything belonged to the same quiet order, waiting to be understood. Yet even in these years of rising influence, something unfinished followed him like a shadow at dusk. Paintings were left incomplete, not from failure, but from an endless pursuit of perfection. He could not release what still whispered of unseen possibility. To others, this seemed like indecision. To Leonardo, it was reverence. He would not pretend an answer was final when a deeper one still called. The court admired him. The Duke relied upon him. Yet Leonardo remained inwardly alone, walking gently between admiration and isolation. In grand halls filled with torchlight and echoing praise, his mind often returned to the quiet hills of Vinci, to the slow clouds and the unhurried streams. The world grew louder around him, but inside, the boy who listened to the wind was still listening. And so, as years folded softly into one another, his life began to hover between wonder and weight. He had risen from fields into fortresses, from shadow into fame. Yet the hunger that first stirred beside whispering water had not been fed. It had only grown more patient, more insistent, guiding him forward into deeper questions of flesh, motion, and the fragile machinery of life itself. And as the night deepened and the candles burned lower, that hunger would soon lead him beyond the visible surface of the world, toward the hidden landscapes beneath skin and bone, where beauty and mystery waited in equal measure. In the hush of late evenings in Milan, when the court's voices faded into distant echoes and the stone corridors cooled beneath drifting torchlight, Leonardo often remained awake in quiet rooms filled with paper, ink, and the soft scratching sound of his thoughts taking shape. Outside, the city rested beneath guarded walls, unaware that within those still rooms, the future was being imagined in careful lines. He would pause for long moments between each stroke, not from doubt but from listening to the rhythm of life beneath the surface of things. listening for answers that did not arrive in words. It was during these nights that his attention turned inward, not toward dreams of flight or bridges of stone, but toward the hidden world inside the human body. The body, to Leonardo, was not merely a vessel to be painted. It was a living architecture, a cathedral built of bone and sinew and motion. To understand it, he believed, was to come closer to understanding the order of creation itself. And so, with quiet courage, he stepped into forbidden territories where few artists of his time dared to wander. Through whispered permissions and shadowed doorways, he gained access to the silent rooms where the dead rested. There was no fear in his hands, only reverence. By trembling candlelight, he traced the gentle curves of muscle, the branching rivers of veins, the delicate machinery that allowed breath to rise and fall. Each discovery filled him with awe rather than triumph. The human body revealed itself not as a mystery to conquer, but as a hymn written in living form. He worked slowly, tenderly, aware that he was standing at the edge of knowledge guarded by both tradition and taboo. Yet nothing in him sought to shock. He studied not for spectacle but for truth. And truth, once glimpsed, could not be unlearned. Each sketch became more than a drawing. It was a quiet promise that someday the world would see what he had seen, and wonder with him. As he studied the mechanics of movement within flesh, a new clarity unfolded within his mind. The joints of the arm mirrored the hinges he designed in wooden inventions. The flow of blood matched the currents of rivers he had drawn years before. The body, the earth, the machine all followed the same invisible laws. This realization settled into him with the calm weight of something eternal. Nothing stood alone. Everything was connected. Yet even with these revelations, Leonardo remained gentle in his approach to the world. He did not thunder with declarations. He whispered through drawings. His notebooks became quiet forests of thought, filled with backward writing that flowed like streams meant only for his own eyes. Ideas layered upon ideas, page after page, unanswered yet alive. He did not feel urgency to publish them. He felt only the slow satisfaction of recording what the world revealed when one listened deeply enough. Beyond the walls of his private study, Milan moved toward darker concerns. Politics tightened its grip. Whispers of conflict stirred in courtyards. The Duke demanded engines not of beauty, but of defense. Leonardo complied, designing machines of war with the same careful precision he once gave to wings meant for the sky. Yet the contrast weighed upon him like a quiet sorrow. He could build instruments of destruction, yes, but his heart still bowed toward life, toward motion without harm, toward flight without fear. Often, while sketching the curve of a cannon's wheel, his mind drifted back to the wings of birds, to the way they cut through air without violence, to the way they rose not by force, but by harmony with the wind. These memories returned to him like tender ghosts. They reminded him of who he had been before ambition surrounded him with armor and expectations. Still, he did not turn away from his circumstances. Leonardo accepted the world as it unfolded before him, without bitterness. His gift was not resistance, but transformation. Even war machines bore the fingerprints of beauty in their symmetry. Even shadows carried the promise of light within their shape. As his reputation spread, so did his sense of displacement. He was admired, yet rarely understood. Patrons marveled at his talent, but few grasped the depth of his longing for knowledge without boundary. He completed commissions slowly, sometimes not at all, not from laziness, but from a devotion to ideals that stretched beyond deadlines and demands. Time, to Leonardo, was not an enemy to race against. It was a current to drift within. At times, this gentle disregard for urgency brought frustration to those who funded his work. But Leonardo remained unchanged. He could not offer haste where his soul offered only patience. And so, while others measured their lives in contracts and rewards, he measured his in layers of understanding, each built quietly upon the last. Years passed like slow-moving clouds. Milan shifted in mood and leadership. War drew nearer, and with it came the awareness that nothing he built here, no matter how intricate, would remain untouched by change. The forts would crumble. The rulers would fade. Even the city's name would someday become a whisper in another century's wind. Yet Leonardo felt no despair in this knowledge. Impermanence did not frighten him, softened him. It reminded him to look more closely at what remained while it remained. The curve of a child's cheek, the bend of an old man's spine, the way candle smoke twisted upward before dissolving into nothing. In these small moments he found the truest anchors of his life. Not fame, not favor, but observation, presence, listening. And somewhere in the quiet of those listening moments, the idea of a final great painting began to stir within him. A face that would hold not just beauty, but mystery. A gaze that would carry both joy and sorrow without declaring either. A smile that would whisper across centuries without ever speaking. The seeds of that vision rested already in his hand, though he did not yet know its name. And so, as the night deepened once more and candlelight quivered across his waiting pages, Leonardo stood gently at the edge of another threshold, unaware that the next turn in his journey would lead him toward the most silent, most enduring expression of wonder the world would ever come to know. The city of Milan eventually loosened its grip on him, not with ceremony, but with the slow unraveling that follows shifting power and uneasy peace. The duke who once sheltered his visions fell from favor, and the walls that had once echoed with praise now whispered with uncertainty. Leonardo gathered his notebooks once more, just as he had done when leaving Florence, and with the same quiet obedience to change, he stepped back onto the open road. He had learned, by now, that stability was only an illusion. Movement was the truth beneath all things. The countryside welcomed him again with familiar tenderness. Fields rolled outward like open pages, rivers curved with unbroken memory, and mountains held the sky with patient strength. These landscapes calmed something in him that cities always stirred. As he walked, he stopped often, to watch the paths ants carved through dust, to trace the spiral of water as it turned around a stone, to observe the way clouds folded into one another like living thoughts. For Leonardo, travel was never merely about distance. It was about seeing old patterns in new light. He arrived again in Florence not as a boy, but as a man shaped by courts and shadows. Yet the city felt both unchanged and entirely new to him. The same towers reached upward. The same river traced its steady course. But within him, entire worlds had shifted. He carried knowledge of the inner body, of motion and pressure and tension. He carried the weight of half-finished commissions and unspoken dreams. And now, perhaps more than ever, he carried a longing to create something that would not merely satisfy patrons, but speak to the quiet depths of the human spirit. It was during this returning season that the vision of a woman's face began to take clearer form in his mind. Not a queen, not a saint, not a figure wrapped in symbols, but a living presence, resting between laughter and loss. He did not chase the vision aggressively. He let it come to him as he let everything else come, slowly, kindly, through observation, through waiting. The woman who would one day become the most famous face in the world entered his life without fanfare. A young wife from a merchant family, her name carried lightly on the streets of Florence, unnoticed by history. To Leonardo, she was not important because of status. She was important because of the quiet balance in her expression. The way her eyes held both openness and distance. The way her mouth hovered at the edge of a smile that never fully settled. When she first sat before him, the room was quiet. Light filtered through soft curtains. Dust drifted lazily through the air. And Leonardo watched her not as an object to be captured, but as a living rhythm to be understood. He watched how her breath lifted her chest, how a thought passed behind her eyes like a cloud traveling across a distant hill. He began with no hurry. The first lines were almost invisible, like the faintest whisper of intention. Day after day she returned, and day after day, the painting grew, not in certainty, but in layers of quiet exploration. Leonardo spoke little as he worked. When he did speak, it was gentle, meant only to ease the stillness. Music sometimes drifted softly through the room. Laughter rose now and then, unforced. He did not want her frozen into stiffness. He wanted the warmth of life to remain present in her posture, in her gaze. Slowly, almost without the noticing of either artist or subject. The boundaries between observation and creation began to blur. The smile that formed on the canvas was not merely hers, and not merely his. It was something that existed between them, born of shared time and attention. A fragile curve that suggested everything without declaring anything. A smile that could belong to joy or to sorrow, to invitation or farewell. Leonardo worked on the painting for years. Not continuously, but in returns. He would set it aside, travel, study, design, observe, and then come back to it with new eyes. Each return deepened it. Shadows softened. Light learned how to linger. The face became not a moment, but many moments woven together. It became not a likeness, but a quiet question. To those who watched him, this devotion to a single portrait seemed strange, even wasteful. Patrons waited for other commissions that remained untouched. But Leonardo followed only the pull that moved without sound inside him. He was not seeking completion. He was seeking truth in its gentlest form. And while the world outside continued to churn with rivalry, invention, and restless ambition, one small wooden panel in a calm studio slowly gathered infinity within its subtle lines. A woman sat, still and breathing. A painter leaned forward, listening to the space between moments. Neither of them could yet know that their quiet meeting would one day outlive empires. And so, as weeks slid into months and months into years, that faint, unclaimed smile continued to grow beneath Leonardo's patient hand, carrying within it the weightless wonder of all that cannot be named, and all that never truly ends. Time moved differently around that quiet portrait. Outside the studio, seasons turned with visible certainty. Summer leaned into autumn. Autumn folded into winter. Snow softened the edges of Florence, and then melted back into green once more. Yet inside, within the small circle of Leonardo's attention, the woman's face seemed to exist beyond time entirely. Each return to the panel felt less like resuming work and more like greeting an old companion who had been patiently waiting in silence. Leonardo's own face changed as years passed. Lines touched his eyes. Silver threaded softly through his hair. But the painting did not age in the same way. It deepened. The skin of the subject seemed to hold warmth without heat. The shadows breathed without darkness. The smile grew neither wider nor thinner, yet it seemed to shift with the mood of whoever stood before it. Some saw joy, some saw sorrow, some saw secrets they could not put into words. And Leonardo, standing before it late at night, often felt as though the painting were quietly observing him in return. There were moments when doubt brushed against him gently, like a passing chill. Was this devotion to one fragile expression a form of delay, or was it the purest form of arrival? He never answered himself in haste. He trusted the pull that had guided him since childhood. The same pull that once led him to follow birds across open fields. The same pull that guided his hand through shadowed studies of muscle and bone. It had never betrayed him, and so he followed it still. Yet even as the painting drew him inward, the world beyond it called him outward once more. Florence, like all cities, was restless. Commissions waited. Patrons promised reward and recognition. And beyond the city's walls, new powers rose and fell with the steady rhythm of ambition. Leonardo felt the gentle pressure of movement again. That familiar whisper that told him it was time to walk forward. He lifted the painting from its resting place as one lifts something alive. Carefully, almost tenderly. It was not finished, not in the way others understood the word. But Leonardo sensed that it never truly would be. Some creations were not meant to reach an end. They were meant only to deepen. And so he carried it with him as he traveled. A quiet companion on dusty roads and through echoing halls. Wherever he went, the woman's calm presence went with him. Kings would come to admire it. Nobles would lean close to read its silence. Yet none would fully possess it, for it belonged not to a place or a patron, but to time itself. Through all these years, Leonardo continued to study. Rivers still fascinated him. Light still captivated him. Machines still grew beneath his hands in lines and gears and half-formed dreams. Yet age had softened something in him as well. The urgency of youth had settled into a deep, unwavering patience. He no longer rushed at knowledge. He walked with it. There was a growing quiet within him now, not of emptiness, but of reflection. He began to look back as often as he looked forward. To see the boy he once was, listening to the wind in the fields of Vinci. To recognize how far that listening had carried him. From dust to quartz, from shadows to light, from questions to deeper questions. And in recognizing this journey, he did not feel pride. He felt gratitude. As the years gathered behind him like soft footprints in snow, Leonardo became more aware of the fragile thread that binds all living things. He saw how quickly power faded, how quietly names were forgotten. Yet he also saw how a single careful line could outlive walls and crowns, how a gentle observation could travel farther than armies ever would, how a smile, barely spoken into existence, could echo beyond centuries. And so the boy who once listened to the wind had become a man who listened to time itself. But even as this awareness settled into him, there remained within his heart the same unfilled space that had always lived there. The soft ache of wonder, the quiet need to keep asking, to keep seeing, to keep becoming. That hunger no longer drove him with restlessness, carried him with calm. And somewhere ahead, unseen but waiting, new chapters of his life were already opening. New courts, new losses, new discoveries, new silences. The road continued to unfold beneath his feet, as it always had. And so, as night gathered gently once more and the world drifted into rest, Leonardo moved forward again, carrying with him not certainty, but the deeper gift of endless curiosity. Chapter 1 closes here, not as an ending, but as a breath held softly before the next long unfolding. The road carried Leonardo onward as it always had, not with urgency, but with an unspoken invitation. Dust gathered on his robes. Wind moved through the fields beside him. The world shifted gently from one horizon to the next. And with each step, he felt a quiet loosening inside, as if the weight of former years were slipping softly from his shoulders. He did not travel to escape his past. He traveled because movement itself had become the language of his becoming. France waited beyond the long curve of his life's journey, offering not conquest, not rivalry, but something far rarer: stillness. King Francis, young and curious, welcomed him not as a servant, but as a treasured mind nearing its sunset. For the first time in many years, Leonardo would not be asked to prove himself with unfinished battles and unending demands. He would be free at last to simply exist as he was. The chateau where he settled rested among quiet trees and slow-moving water. Light slid gently across stone walls. Morning arrived without bells of command. Evening came without the echo of courts. Here, the world did not pull at him with sharp fingers. It opened its hands and waited. Leonardo felt the change almost immediately. His breath deepened. His steps slowed. His thoughts drifted not toward what must be built, but toward what had been. He brought with him very little of what the world valued, but everything that mattered to him. His notebooks traveled at his side, filled with the lifelong murmurs of his curiosity. And beside them, wrapped with careful devotion, the unfinished portrait of a woman whose smile had followed him for years like a quiet companion. It was placed where soft daylight could reach it each morning, as if it too required nourishment from the sun. Here, in this gentler season of his life, Leonardo did not stop working. He simply worked differently. There was no longer urgency in his hands, only reflection. He opened his notebooks not to invent, but to converse with his younger self. Pages filled decades apart now lay side by side. Drawings of flying machines rested beside late sketches of water in slow rotation. As he traced these earlier visions, he did not judge them with regret. He met them with kindness, as one meets an old memory with softened eyes. Sometimes he would sit for long hours without drawing at all. He would watch dust dance in the slanted light. He would listen to wind pass through leaves with the same attention he once gave to royal requests. He had always been a student of movement. Now he studied stillness. Visitors came, of course. Scholars, artists, nobles, all drawn by the quiet gravity of his name. They arrived with questions shaped like hunger. They expected declarations, answers, final truths from a man the world had already begun to call immortal. But Leonardo offered something gentler than certainty. He offered reflection. He spoke of how water seeks its own level, of how light bends more softly than force, of how knowledge grows not by conquering, but by listening. Many left puzzled. A few left changed. In quiet moments alone, he often turned his gaze to the portrait. The face had not changed, yet he had. And in that exchange between familiar mystery and deepening age, he felt a subtle understanding unfold. The painting had never been about capturing a woman. It had been about capturing the unreachable place between moments. The place where life hovers before becoming memory. Leonardo began to feel the soft presence of endings, not as fear, but as a gentle tide drawing near the shore. His body tired more easily now. His hands, once endlessly precise, sometimes trembled. Yet his mind felt wider than it had ever been. Free of the pressures of proving and performing, it drifted outward into pure contemplation. He walked slowly through gardens. He watched children play with sticks and stones as if they were entire universes. He smiled not with pride, not with sorrow, but with the recognition that all becoming begins again in small hands and quiet wonder. At night, the same stars that once watched over the fields of Vinci now hovered above his final home. They looked no different. Perhaps that was the lesson they had always carried, that the world, vast and patient, continues its slow breathing whether one is just beginning or softly concluding. And in that shared breathing with the universe itself, Leonardo felt neither young nor old. He felt simply present. Yet even in this gentle stillness, something within him stirred once more. Not with restlessness, not with ambition, but with memory, with the quiet desire to follow the thread of his life backward through its shadows and lights, to feel its full shape at last. And as moonlight brushed his window and the chateau sank into sleep, Leonardo closed his eyes beside his open notebooks, drifting backward through time toward the boy he once was, the boy who listened to the wind. And so, in this quiet turning inward, the next movement of his story began. Sleep came to him more easily now than it ever had before. Not the heavy sleep of exhaustion, but the gentle kind that arrives when the mind no longer resists the dark. And within that sleep, memories moved like slow constellations, lighting small portions of his past before fading into wider night. Faces long gone returned without their weight. Voices he had not heard in decades spoke again without demand. He drifted through these inner landscapes as quietly as he once drifted through fields and streets, observing without grasping. When he woke, morning entered his room without urgency. Pale light climbed the walls. Birds stitched song into the air beyond the window. Leonardo rested for a while before rising, feeling the subtle stiffness of age in his bones, yet greeting it without resentment. Every body, he knew, obeyed the same laws he had traced so carefully in candlelit rooms. There was no betrayal in this slowing, only design. He moved toward the window and looked out upon the water. A thin layer of mist floated just above its surface, blurring reflection and reality into one breathing form. How many times had he drawn water in motion? How many times had he followed it with his eyes, trying to understand not just its path, but its intention? Even now, at the quiet edge of his life, it continued to teach him that movement need not be rushed, that surrender holds its own kind of strength. Later, seated at his table, he opened an old notebook at random. The page revealed the sketch of a wing, drawn decades earlier with the urgency of youthful belief. He traced the line with a slow finger. He smiled, not with mockery, but with tenderness. He had once truly believed he would lift humanity into the sky with wood and cloth. In some ways he had, not with flight itself but with possibility. And perhaps that was enough. Visitors were fewer now. The world beyond his quiet residence continued to churn with conflict and crowns. Yet those storms felt distant. King Francis still came at times, not as a ruler seeking counsel, but as a young man listening to an elder soul. They would walk slowly through gardens. Leonardo would speak of rivers and light. of how everything the eye sees is shaped by unseen movement. And the king would listen, not always understanding the words, but sensing the peace that carried them. In these walks, Leonardo felt something he had rarely known in earlier years: to be valued without being used, to be heard without being demanded. It was a gentle closing of a circle he had not known was open. Often, after such visits, he returned again to the portrait. Time had softened the colors further. Shadows had grown deeper, more effortless. The smile still hovered between meanings. He sometimes wondered if the world would ever understand what he had been trying to say with it. But that question no longer troubled him. Understanding, he had learned, was not a gathering of answers. It was a way of standing inside mystery without fear. As his strength waned slowly, he spent more hours in reflection than in drawing. Yet the act of observing never left him. Even when his hands were still, his mind remained in gentle motion. He watched how pain rose and fell like weather, how breath sometimes felt shallow and at other times full as open sky, how each day carried its own quiet signature. There were moments, especially near dusk, when he felt the soft ache of all that remained unfinished. The wings that never lifted, the machines left only as promises on paper, the studies that never found their final form. But regret did not settle into him as bitterness. It passed through him as a light sadness, like the memory of a song only half remembered. He had learned that incompletion was not always failure. Sometimes it was invitation, left behind for other hands and other minds. At night, when the chateau grew silent and the world seemed to lower its voice, he often lay awake beneath thin blankets, listening to the deep easing of his own breath. He would think of Florence, of Milan, of dusty roads under burning sun, of rivers he had walked beside and never seen again. Faces returned in flickers softened by time. Verrocchio, his early master, the quiet woman with the almost smile, friends who had faded into names written only in memory. Strangely, he did not feel alone in these moments. The past did not surround him as a crowd. It rested beside him as a presence. And in that presence, he found a calm companionship that did not ask anything of him. There came an evening when his breath felt shallower than usual, when each movement seemed to carry a little more weight. He walked with the assistance of his student and companion through the fading light of the garden. The sky opened into slow rivers of gold and lavender. He stopped often, not from weakness alone, but from wonder. Even now, even here, the world continued to arrive as if for the first time. He watched the sun slip behind the distant trees, and for a moment, he felt that familiar stirring deep in his chest. The same quiet pull that had guided him since childhood. Not toward invention, not toward discovery, but toward understanding without edges. That night, as he returned to his room, he stood for a long while before the portrait. He did not speak. He did not reach out. He only looked, and in that shared stillness between man and image, something unspoken passed like a final acknowledgement between them. A recognition without words. A closing of a long, silent conversation. When he finally turned away, he felt neither loss nor fear. Only a deep, unhurried peace, as if he were resting in the palm of time itself. And so, as sleep gathered around him once more and the world beyond the window continued its slow turning, Leonardo drifted toward the final quiet of his life, carrying with him every river he had followed, every shadow he had traced, and every question he had learned to hold without needing to solve. The days that followed moved with a softer gravity, as if the world itself had grown aware of his slowing steps and adjusted its pace to match. Morning no longer arrived with sharp edges. It unfolded gently, light seeping into the room like breath easing into tired lungs. Leonardo would wake without urgency, resting for a while in that quiet place between sleep and awareness where thought drifted freely and memory felt close enough to touch. His student would help him dress, not with ceremony, but with the simple tenderness that grows between two people who have walked a long distance together. Leonardo accepted the help without pride and without shame. The body, he knew, was only borrowing time now, and time, like water, always continues its flow. He spent more hours in his chair near the window, watching the garden change in its smallest details. New leaves unfolded without asking to be noticed. Petals fell without knowing they were beautiful. Children's laughter from far beyond the walls floated in and then vanished, leaving no wound in the silence. Everything arrived, everything left. And for the first time in his long life, Leonardo felt no urge to hold any of it still. Sometimes, King Francis returned and sat beside him in quiet conversation. There were fewer questions now, more shared stillness. The king would speak of the burdens of rule, of the weight of choices made for millions of unseen lives. Leonardo listened with the same attention he once gave to rivers and bones. When he spoke in return, it was not with solutions but with reflections. That power, like water, seeks paths of least resistance. That force alone rarely sustains what it builds. That gentleness, though often ignored, endures in ways strength cannot. The king did not always understand, but he always felt the calm beneath the words. And in that calm, something in him softened. In the afternoons, Leonardo's gaze sometimes wandered back to his notebooks, now spread across tables like quiet companions waiting patiently for his attention. He did not fill them as he once had. Instead, he turned pages slowly, revisiting lines drawn by younger hands. There were moments when he barely remembered the circumstances that had given birth to a drawing. Yet the curiosity within each page still felt familiar, like hearing one's own voice echo from long ago in a distant valley. One afternoon, he paused upon a page filled with studies of the heart, the careful chambers, the delicate pathways of blood. He traced the ink with trembling fingers. The heart had once been his greatest mechanical mystery. Valves opening, closing, opening again. Rhythm without thought. Life without language. Now, as his own rhythm softened and slowed, he felt a quiet intimacy with that mystery he had only once approached with scientific distance. He placed his hand over his chest and listened. The sound was no longer as steady as it had been. It wandered. It hesitated. It resumed. Yet within its uncertain pulse, there was still purpose, still movement, still the promise that motion, no matter how slow, is never truly spent. At times, weakness folded around him suddenly, and he would rest in deeper stillness. During these hours, his mind drifted more freely than ever before. He remembered his mother's face only in fragments now, like a half-faded dream. He remembered the smell of fresh-cut wood in Verrocchio's workshop. He remembered the chill of stone floors in Milan beneath pre-dawn light. These memories did not arrive in neat order. They came as the world itself comes, layered, interwoven, without asking permission. And beneath them all, always, there was the soft memory of listening. The listening that had begun before he ever knew what it meant to speak. As his strength declined further, nights grew longer in waking awareness. Sleep still came, but it came and went like a visitor who stayed only briefly. During these quiet hours, Leonardo often gazed into the darkness with untroubled eyes. He did not search there for ghosts or visions. He simply allowed the dark to be what it was. A wide, open space where nothing demanded and everything rested. Once, during such a night, he reached toward the painting one final time. With careful hands, he adjusted its position slightly, so the faintest hint of moonlight brushed across the soft curve of the smile. The face seemed to breathe in that pale glow. For a long while, he and the painting remained in shared silence. There was no farewell spoken between them. There was no need. Their conversation had never required words. He returned to his bed with measured steps. The weight of his body settled gently into stillness. His breath moved shallow and slow. And as he lay there, he felt not the sharp pull of an ending, but the round quiet of return. As if he were not leaving the world, but blending back into it, becoming one of its slow, unseen movements at last. Outside, the river continued to slide past its ancient banks. Stars drifted in patterns too vast for naming. Somewhere, a bird called once into the night and then fell silent. The world breathed on, and Leonardo, who had spent his life listening to its breath, listened still. The rhythm of the chateau settled deeper into quiet as winter drew its slow veil across the land. Frost traced delicate patterns along the edges of the windows each morning, as if the cold itself had learned to draw. Leonardo watched these silent sketches with gentle fascination. Even now, even at the furthest edge of his strength, the world continued to create without effort. This, more than anything, comforted him. He spent many hours wrapped in layers of soft cloth, seated near the warmth of the hearth. Firelight moved across the walls in restless gold, echoing the motion of candle flames he had once studied so closely in darker years. The crack and sigh of burning would become a quiet companion, filling the room with the scent of smoke and memory. He no longer drew the flames. He simply watched, and in watching, he felt no distance between the observer and the observed. His student remained close now, often working silently nearby, sorting papers, tending the modest duties of care. There were few words between them. What remained to be said had already been lived. Occasionally, their eyes would meet in gentle acknowledgement, and that was enough. Leonardo had always believed that the deepest understanding passed without sound. His body weakened further as the weeks unfolded. Some mornings he woke with little memory of the dreams that had carried him through the night. Other mornings, fragments lingered. A bird's wing lifting through pale sky, a river turning around stone, a face half smiling from shadow. These small echoes drifted through him without urgency, like leaves floating on slow water. There were moments when pain rose suddenly, sharp but brief, like a quick reminder from flesh that it was still part of the story. He met these moments with steady breath. Pain, he knew, was simply another form of sensation, another signal in the grand language of the body. He neither chased it nor pushed it away. He let it speak and then fall silent again. One afternoon, as pale light slipped through thinning clouds, King Francis came once more. This time he arrived without the trappings of royalty. No procession, no display. He came as a man approaching another man who stood at the far border of departure. He sat beside Leonardo in the quiet room without ceremony, as if they were simply two figures resting beside the same river. They did not speak at first. The fire murmured softly between them. Outside, bare branches sighed with the movement of wind. At last, the king's voice broke the stillness in a whisper. He asked not about inventions, nor paintings, nor the secrets of genius. He asked how it felt to reach the end of such a long road. Leonardo considered the question slowly. When he answered, his voice was soft but steady. He said that the road had never truly felt like a line. It had always felt like water, moving, turning, returning. He said that at the end, one does not feel as though one has arrived at a wall but at a widening, a place where the current grows broader and quieter, a place where effort dissolves into drift. The king listened, eyes shining with something he could not fully name. He did not press for further words. Some truths, he sensed, were not meant to be explained. They were meant to be approached in silence. Before leaving, he stood and placed a gentle hand upon Leonardo's shoulder. No titles were spoken, no legacy named, only a quiet gratitude passed between them. And then the king departed, his footsteps fading softly into the distant corridors. Leonardo did not watch him go. He closed his eyes and rested instead, feeling the warmth of the fire and the slow, measured rhythm of breath rising and falling within his chest. For the first time, even the idea of time felt faint. Days no longer separated into past and future. They blurred into a single, continuous presence. That night, sleep took him deeper than it had in many weeks. He drifted not through memory this time, but through something smoother and wider. There were no clear images, no faces, no roads, only motion without direction, only a vast quiet that felt at once empty and full. When he woke, dawn was already touching the edge of the sky. Pale gray light softened the darkness without breaking it entirely. For a long while, Leonardo lay still, listening to the distant call of birds he could not see. Their voices traveled thinly through the cold air, delicate and unburdened by meaning. He felt weaker now than he ever had before. Even lifting his hand required intention. Yet within that weakness he felt no distress. Only a deep, steady acceptance. The body was simply completing its long, faithful work. His student noticed the change immediately and remained close throughout the morning. Water was brought. A few careful sips were taken. Leonardo's eyes drifted often toward the window, then toward the painting resting quietly in its place of light. The smile met him once more, unchanged, unclaimed by time. A faint expression, not quite a smile of his own, touched his lips in response. It was as if he recognized in that painted face the same quiet farewell that now moved through his own being. The hours passed without weight. The room was filled with light, then shadow, then light again. At some point, Leonardo's breathing grew slower, softer, like waves reaching farther apart as they returned to open water. His hand relaxed in his student's grasp. There was no final gesture, no dramatic rise or fall, only an easing, a gentle releasing of tension that had been loosening for many years. Outside, the world did not pause. Wind moved through trees. Water continued its patient path. The sky shifted with indifferent grace. Life, as it always had, carried on without announcement. Yet within that quiet room, something immense had changed without sound. Leonardo da Vinci, who had listened so long to the secrets of light, motion, and form, had at last become silent himself. The room did not feel empty after his breathing stilled, felt wider, as if the quiet had gained new depth, like water after a stone has finished sinking. Leonardo's body rested with the calm it had always sought in motion. The lines of effort that once shaped his face had softened into something gentler, something almost childlike. His student remained beside him for a long while, holding that quiet as one holds a flame from the wind, careful not to disturb what had just passed. Outside the chateau, the day continued without knowing. Light shifted across frost and stone. Somewhere, a bell rang faintly in the distance. A cart passed along the road. The small rhythms of ordinary life moved on, unaware that one of the greatest listeners the world had ever known had fallen silent. And yet, in ways too subtle for sight, everything had changed. Word of his passing traveled softly at first, then outward like circles on water. Scholars paused over their books. Artists lowered their hands. The king received the news without spectacle, and for a long while, he said nothing at all. The man who had spoken to him of rivers and gentleness was now part of the same great current he had always described. Leonardo's few belongings were gathered carefully. The notebooks, worn by decades of touch, were stacked with reverence. The drawings, some faint and uncertain, others bold and intricate, were treated now as fragile maps left behind by someone who had walked far ahead. And the painting, the quiet woman with the unclaimed smile, was lifted once more and prepared for its final journey away from the man who had carried it across years and nations. When at last the room stood empty, something remained that could not be moved. Presence without shape. A listening that lingered in the walls, in the window light, in the hush that now felt permanent. The world beyond the chateau did what it always does after loss. It answered with noise. Debates would follow. Stories would grow in uneven shapes. Some would elevate him into legend. Others would bend his life into narrow explanations. His name would be spoken in reverence, in argument, in wonder. Yet none of these sounds would be able to reach him now. And perhaps that was as it should be. For Leonardo had never truly belonged to noise. He had belonged to the space between sounds, to the pause between heartbeats, to the moment just before a bird lifts from branch, to the thin edge where light becomes shadow. His story, however, was only beginning to separate itself from his body. In the years that followed, his notebooks would awaken minds he had never met. Engineers would trace trembling lines left by his early dreams of wings and gears. Doctors would rediscover the maps of muscle and bone he had drawn in candlelit secrecy. Painters would return again and again to the quiet architecture of his faces, searching for the way he had made stillness breathe. And through it all, that small painted smile would travel farther than any of his imagined machines ever could. Across borders, across languages, across centuries, it would become a mirror in which each generation saw not the woman he once observed, but their own unfolding mysteries. What Leonardo left behind was not a single answer. It was a way of approaching the world. To look slowly, to question gently, to listen without needing to conquer. If there was a lesson hidden within his long, unhurried life, it was this: that the greatest discoveries are not always made by those who shout the loudest, nor by those who arrive the fastest. They are made by those who stay close to wonder long enough for wonder to speak back. And now, as the world turned without him, as rivers he once studied continued their eternal work, as stars he once traced with questions kept their distant watch, Leonardo's presence shifted from what could be seen to what could only be felt. He had become part of the silence he had always trusted. And somewhere in that silence, far beyond the reach of names and dates, the listening continued on without him, shaped forever by the way he once listened first. Chapter 2 closes here, not in finality, but in widening. Would you like to continue into Chapter 3, where Leonardo's hidden influence begins its long journey across the centuries? Long after his hands had gone still, Leonardo's thoughts continued to travel. They moved not through rooms and roads now, but through other minds, through centuries that had not yet been born when he first traced the curve of a bird's wing in dust. His absence did not arrive as an ending. It arrived as a quiet dispersal, like mist lifting from a river at dawn, becoming part of everything without ever being seen again as one shape. For a time, his notebooks slept. They were stored, moved, forgotten, rediscovered, misplaced again. Pages curled with age. Ink softened into the paper that had once received it with trembling absorption. Generations passed without knowing what they held. Kingdoms rose and fell above them like waves passing over stones that never felt the force of their motion. And yet, even in their silence, the ideas waited. The world, outside those resting pages, continued its long, uncertain walk through shadow and light. Wars wrote their brief signatures across the land. Diseases came and went like dark seasons. New rulers promised renewal. Old rulers crumbled into names on tombs. Through it all, humanity kept asking the same old questions in new voices. How to move faster. How to see farther. How to hold life longer than it wishes to be held. It would take time before the quiet answers Leonardo had left behind were ready to be heard. When at last his notebooks began to surface again, it was not with a trumpet's call, but with the careful lifting of a single page. A scholar leaning over a desk. An engineer pausing mid-thought. A doctor tracing lines with a softened breath. Each discovery happened alone at first, in private moments of startled recognition. They would open a page and feel it. Not shock, not confusion, but the strange sensation of being met across time by a mind that had already been there. Already asked the same question, already waited patiently for the answer. His drawings of the human body re-entered the world like whispered truths. The heart, once drawn with trembling devotion, began to speak again through new understanding. The branching rivers of veins and arteries revealed patterns that medicine had only begun to comprehend. Doctors found themselves guided by lines drawn centuries before, as if a silent hand were still pointing gently toward what mattered. There was wonder in this rediscovery, but there was also humility. For it became clear that Leonardo had walked into rooms of knowledge long before the lights had been turned on. He had seen without the help of the tools later minds would depend upon. His eyes, his patience, his listening had been enough. Engineers, too, felt his echo stir. They unfolded pages filled with impossible machines. Wings made for human backs. Gears that promised motion through balance alone. Bridges that could rise like an arm and fall like a breath. At first, many smiled at these visions as the hopeful fantasies of another age. And yet, as their own inventions grew closer to his imagined forms, the smiles faded into something quieter. Recognition. He had not built these machines, but he had seen them, and in seeing them, he had planted their future like seeds beneath the soil of time. Across the centuries, artists returned again and again to his work, not for instruction alone, but for reassurance. They studied the softness of his shadows, the restraint of his lines, the way his figures seemed to breathe without effort. They learned that power does not always announce itself through boldness. Sometimes it speaks through restraint so tender it almost vanishes. And always they return to the smile. That small, quiet curve that once formed in a sunlit Florentine room followed the world into new ages. Crowds gathered before it. Empires displayed it as proof of possession. Scholars argued over it. Poets surrendered to it. It was photographed, copied, argued over again. And through all of this relentless attention, it remained what it had always been. A question without an answer. An expression that gave without explaining. People searched it for joy and found sorrow. They searched it for secrets and found themselves. And in that silent exchange between viewer and image, Leonardo continued to listen. The strange thing about influence is that it often arrives disguised as inevitability. What once belonged to a single, wandering mind begins to feel as if it had always been part of the world. As if it were not given by a man at all, but discovered by time itself. So it was with Leonardo. His way of seeing became woven into how the world learned to look. Science learned to observe more slowly. Art learned to value what could not be named. Engineering learned that imagination was not the opposite of practicality, but its beginning. Even anatomy learned that understanding the body required not only precision, but reverence. Yet for all this reach, Leonardo remained strangely distant from the version of himself the world constructed. Statues fixed him into heroic stillness. Portraits cast him as a solitary titan of thought. Myths grew heavy around his name. And still, beneath all of that, the truth was quieter. He had been a man who wandered, a man who waited, a man who listened. As centuries carried his shadow forward, it stretched and shifted into shapes he never could have predicted. His ideas were lifted into schools, into machines, into systems, into dreams that raced far faster than his slow, patient steps ever had. And with that speed came both creation and destruction. The same understanding that healed allowed harm. The same knowledge that lifted also pierced. Leonardo had known this in his way. He had stood between wings and weapons, between beauty and force, long before the world made that line into a battlefield of progress. His life had been a quiet warning as much as a quiet gift. That what the human mind creates will always carry the mark of what the human heart desires. In the age that followed him, that truth only grew louder. And yet, beneath all the noise of advancement and ambition, there remained the thinner, steadier thread of his original way of seeing. The way that did not rush. The way that did not conquer. The way that simply watched and asked and waited. That way never disappeared. It moved from hand to hand, from eye to eye, from teacher to student, from parent to child, often unrecognized, often unnamed, but always alive beneath the surface of human curiosity. Leonardo had become more than a memory. He had become a method of wonder. And as the world surged forward into machines he once only imagined, into skies he had once only sketched, into bodies whose secrets he had once traced by candlelight, his quiet presence followed invisibly behind it all, like the echo of a question that refuses to grow silent. And so the story of his life, which began in a small Tuscan village, now widened into the story of the world itself. The world that received Leonardo's ideas was not gentle. It was loud with ambition, crowded with certainty, and often impatient with the slow, fragile ways of wonder. His notebooks emerged into workshops filled with smoke and clatter, into classrooms heavy with rules, into cities where progress marched with iron steps. And yet, even in those restless places, something of his softness survived. Men opened his pages and felt their breathing change. They did not always understand what they saw at first. His sketches moved sideways through thought, refusing clean borders. A bird's wing became a question about air. A whirlpool became a question about motion. A human heart became a question about longing as much as blood. These drawings did not offer commands. They offered invitations. And that was what made them dangerous to rigid minds and irresistible to restless ones. In the early centuries after his passing, his name drifted like a half-remembered melody through Europe's growing hunger for knowledge. It appeared in quiet footnotes, in careful citations, in the guarded exchanges of scholars who spoke his thoughts without always daring to speak his name. He was both everywhere and nowhere at once. Science began to harden into structure during these years. Rules were written, systems were built, truth was pressed into orderly frames. And as this happened, some looked back at Leonardo with a kind of uneasy admiration. He did not belong easily to their new categories. He did not divide the world into subjects and disciplines. He had let everything bleed into everything else. Art into anatomy, mechanics into beauty, mathematics into rivers and clouds. For those who felt trapped by labels, he became a quiet rebellion. Young students, far from Florence and Milan, traced his sketches not just to learn technique, but to feel what it was like to think without walls, to let a question wander instead of cornering it, to observe without immediately claiming meaning. In candlelit rooms and borrowed study halls, Leonardo lived again in the silence between scratch of pen and held breath. But influence is never a straight path. As machines grew stronger, as cities rose taller, as weapons became more precise, the gentle origins of some ideas faded behind their sharper uses. Human flight, once only a yearning sketched in charcoal, began to take shape in wood and fabric. Early attempts failed often and fell hard. Bodies met the earth with broken certainty. Yet still, the dream refused to release its hold. Men looked at the sky and thought of wings. They did not always think of Leonardo when they did. But the way they thought about the sky, as something to be studied rather than worshipped from a distance, carried his fingerprint. He had taught the world, quietly, that the air itself could be read if one listened closely enough. Medicine, too, walked into a new age with his shadow trailing behind it. The body, once seen as a vessel of humors and mystery alone, began to open itself to study without apology. Anatomy moved from the margins into the center of human understanding. Surgeons learned to trust what their eyes revealed. Physicians learned to ask not only what hurt, but how it moved. And still, in dusty archives and forgotten chests, Leonardo's drawings waited. Some were found too early, some too late, some not at all. But even those that never reemerged had already done their work simply by existing once. Ideas once imagined do not fully vanish. They linger in the shared unconscious of human curiosity, resurfacing when the time grows ready. There were moments, though, when the world nearly lost him entirely. Wars scattered libraries. Fires folded knowledge into ash. Borders shifted, and with them the guardianship of memory. His notebooks were sold, traded, misplaced, hidden. They passed through hands that did not know what they held. And yet, time itself seemed to conspire to protect enough of him for his voice to continue whispering. Perhaps this, too, was part of his way of seeing. That no single lifetime owns the truth it discovers. That knowledge survives not through certainty, but through fragility, through chance, through human hands that do not always understand their own importance. As centuries rolled forward, Leonardo's name grew heavier with meaning. What had once been lightly spoken in narrow rooms now carried the echo of legend. He was called a genius, a master, a miracle. The word echoed across classrooms and galleries, through textbooks and speeches. And yet, the weight of that title slowly began to drift away from the man himself. People admired the idea of Leonardo more than they understood the human being he had been. They spoke of brilliance as if it were lightning, sudden and blinding, rare and unreachable. They forgot the long hours of not knowing, the slow patience, the abandoned projects, the unfinished works, the doubts that had lived beside his questions as constant companions. Leonardo had not been lightning. He had been weather, gradual, uncertain, changing, always responding to the world rather than commanding it. And because the world misunderstood this, many began to chase genius instead of practicing listening. They sought moments of glory rather than years of observation. They asked how to become another Leonardo without first learning how to be themselves in quiet company with curiosity. Even so, beneath the misunderstandings, his truest gift endured. He had shown that the human mind does not need permission to wander, that art and science are not rivals but siblings, that wonder is not weakness but fuel. Even when his name was attached to myths too heavy for any real man to carry, these softer lessons continued to pass unnoticed from one searching soul to another. In workshops where gears turned and sparks leapt, his balance between precision and imagination lingered. In studios where light fell across faces waiting to be painted, his patience with shadow remained. In hospitals where hands moved carefully across fragile lives, his reverence for the body whispered through every steady breath. He was no longer there, and yet he was everywhere. Not as a figure, not as a statue, not as a legend, but as a way of approaching the unknown without fear. And as the world hurried into ages of steam and steel, of circuits and signals, of speed beyond anything he could have imagined, that quiet way of seeing became more necessary than ever before. Because progress, when it forgets how to listen, begins to outrun its own wisdom. Leonardo's true inheritance was not the machines he dreamed. It was the slowness he practiced, the tenderness with which he approached even the smallest detail, the patience that refused to rush truth into convenient shapes. And somewhere in the deep undercurrent of history, beneath the roar of invention and the thunder of change, that slowness continued to flow, unnoticed by most, felt by a few, waiting to be heard again. And so the influence of a man who once studied dripping water and folding wings continued its long, unseen journey through the restless future of humanity. By the time the world reached the age of steam and iron, Leonardo's presence had become both distant and strangely immediate. Trains cut across the land like veins of fire. Factories rose where fields once slept. The rhythm of human life quickened, and with it came a growing hunger to master what once had only been observed. Motion was no longer only a mystery to study. It was a force to command. Leonardo would not have recognized the noise of it all. And yet, beneath the roar of engines and the hiss of pressurized air, his questions still lingered. They lay hidden inside blueprints and measurements, inside the longing to lift heavier loads, to travel farther distances, to see beyond the curve of the hills that had once bounded every human horizon. Flight, the oldest of his dreams, began to stir again. At first it came clumsily, balloons rising like trembling moons above startled crowds, fragile gliders leaping from cliffs with hopeful recklessness. Men and women looked up with the same ache Leonardo had once carried in his chest when he first traced the spine of a wing with charcoal. The sky, which had always belonged to birds and clouds, began to feel nearer, not yet reachable, but closer than it had ever been. Each failed attempt was met with blood and silence, each success with wonder and fear braided together. And in every sketch pinned to a workshop wall, in every nervous calculation of lift and drag, one could feel the echo of hands that had drawn the same question centuries earlier by candlelight. Not as instruction, but as permission. Medicine, too, crossed a painful threshold in this age. The body, once a sacred mystery, became a territory to map with relentless precision. Surgeons cut deeper than ever before. Diseases were named, studied, chased. Life was prolonged in ways that would have seemed like sorcery to earlier centuries. And yet, even as science sharpened its tools, it struggled to remember the reverence that Leonardo had carried so naturally. Some doctors learned speed. Others still learned listening. Those who listened discovered that healing is not merely the correction of broken systems, but the quiet restoration of balance. They learned that the body speaks not just in symptoms, but in rhythm, posture, breath. They learned, as Leonardo had learned, that to touch life is to approach something that cannot be fully owned. Art, in this louder world, fractured into many restless paths. Some artists chased realism with ruthless detail. Others fled into abstraction, seeking refuge from a reality that felt too sharp to endure. The calm unity that Leonardo had held between beauty and observation seemed to splinter beneath the weight of modern feeling. And yet, even in the most distant departures from his style, his spirit endured as a question rather than a rule. What does it mean to truly see? Painters still wrestled with light. Sculptors still searched for the balance between tension and rest. Photographers, with their new strange power to steal moments from time, unknowingly chased the same gentleness Leonardo had sought when he softened edges and let shadows breathe. The world had changed its tools. It had not changed its longing. As electricity began to thread through cities like invisible rivers, humanity stepped into a new kind of night, one no longer governed by stars alone. Darkness was pushed back by glowing glass. Time stretched later into human hands. Sleep itself was reshaped by artificial suns that refused to set. In this reshaping, something delicate was lost. The slow evenings, the natural hush, the long patience of watching without interruption. And yet, in quiet rooms far from the brightest streets, some still returned to old pages. Some still leaned over faded paper and felt their breath settle. They traced Leonardo's reversed handwriting with gentle effort. They followed his wandering thoughts from water to muscle to cloud to gear. And in doing so, they remembered something the modern world struggled to hold. That speed is not the same as understanding. The more the world rushed, the more necessary his slowness became. His notebooks, when studied with care, revealed not a march toward certainty, but a dance with uncertainty. He had drawn the same question many times from different angles. He had returned to the same mysteries without embarrassment. He had allowed himself to not know fully and honestly, not as a weakness but as a method. For every door that opens outward also opens inward. The more the world grew vast, the more the human heart felt the need for anchoring, for something slower, for something that did not rush past itself in the pursuit of what comes next. In this hunger, Leonardo returned again, not in monuments, not in slogans, but in whispers of practice, in the choice to look twice, in the decision to wait, in the willingness to let a question remain open. He had never tried to finish the world. He had only tried to meet it honestly, one observation at a time. And now, as humanity stood at the edge of a new millennium with its hands full of light and its heart full of unease, that honesty became the rarest treasure of all. The machines were faster, but the need to listen had never been greater. And so, quietly, beneath the thunder of progress and the trembling hope of the future, Leonardo's way of seeing continued to drift forward, threaded through the consciousness of a species still learning how to be both powerful and gentle at the same time. And as the next century prepared to rise, that question he had carried all his life remained unanswered, waiting patiently in the deep silence between one breath and the next. The 21st century did not arrive gently. It arrived in a rush of glowing screens and ceaseless signals, in a world that could no longer remember what it felt like to be truly still. Images poured through human eyes like endless rivers. Voices arrived from everywhere at once. Time itself seemed to fracture into fragments too small to hold. The world had never been more awake, and it had never been more tired. In this bright exhaustion, Leonardo returned in unexpected ways. Not as a distant master in marble halls, but as a quiet companion to those who felt overwhelmed by the speed of everything. His notebooks, now digitized and scattered across invisible networks of light, found their way into bedrooms, classrooms, cafes, and late-night hours where the mind wandered restlessly in search of something slower. People who had never stood before his paintings traced his sketches with their fingertips across glass. They zoomed into veins he had drawn 5 centuries earlier and marveled that a man with candlelight and patience had seen so clearly. They watched slow recreations of his machines unfold in silent animations and felt, strangely, comforted. His thoughts moved now at the speed of electricity. And yet, the way they were meant to be received had not changed at all. To truly meet Leonardo, one still had to slow down. Some did. In a world obsessed with quick answers, there were those who stopped asking how to become successful and began asking how to become attentive. They took up drawing not to be seen, but to see. They studied anatomy not to conquer illness alone, but to understand the wonder of balance. They studied flight not only for travel, but for awe. To these quiet seekers, Leonardo felt less like a legend and more like a presence sitting beside them, wordlessly reminding them to look again. Children, too, found him in new ways, not through stern lectures of history, but through simple curiosity, through building small machines from scraps, through sketching animals they loved, through wondering why shadows moved the way they did across bedroom walls at dusk. Without knowing it, they practiced his oldest lesson. the courage to wonder without demanding immediate reward. Teachers saw it in their eyes. That moment when a student stops trying to impress and begins simply trying to understand. In that moment, Leonardo lived again. Artists in the modern age felt his influence in subtler ways. The tools were now digital. The canvases were made of light. But the questions remained unchanged. How to capture stillness in motion. How to hold mystery without solving it. How to let a face reveal a soul without ever naming it. Some painters still turned back to the softness of his shadows. Some sculptors still sought the quiet balance he had loved between tension and rest. Some filmmakers built entire worlds around the unspoken, trusting silence the way Leonardo once trusted space between lines. Science, too, carried his echo into its deepest frontiers. Physicists peered into the invisible lattices of reality. Biologists listened to the language of cells. Astronomers traced ancient light across distances so vast that time itself bent under their gaze. And amid all these towering discoveries, the same old humility returned. The more humanity learned, the more it realized how much remained unknown. Leonardo had always stood comfortably in that not knowing. He had never feared the unanswered question. He had let it breathe. And now, in an age where every answer generated 1,000 more mysteries, that comfort with uncertainty became a form of quiet strength. Yet the world also struggled. The same speed that spread knowledge spread fear. The same networks that carried beauty carried cruelty. Screens that connected also isolated. The human nervous system, shaped for slower rhythms, strained beneath the weight of endless stimulation. It was in this tension that Leonardo's gentleness returned with the greatest urgency. People began to speak again of mindfulness without always knowing why the word felt necessary. They returned to practices of observation, of reflection, of stillness. Some found it in meditation, some in drawing, some in walking without destination, some in simply sitting and watching the ordinary miracle of breath. They did not always know they were walking in Leonardo's shadow, but they were. In museums, crowds still gathered before the quiet smile. They raised their phones. They captured its image. They moved on. Yet there were always a few who lingered longer than the rest. A few who stood so still that time seemed to soften around them. For these people, the painting became not an artifact, but a presence. A communion across centuries. The smile met them not with answers, but with invitation. Who are you beneath your speed? What do you hear when the noise falls away? What remains when you stop trying to grasp? These questions did not shout. They waited. Leonardo's legacy, in the end, was never about mastery alone. It was about meeting the world with a kind of quiet courage. The courage to look without flinching. The courage to wonder without consuming. The courage to remain tender in a world that often rewards hardness. He had lived as if listening itself were a sacred act. And in an age that struggles most with listening, that act has become his most enduring gift. Now, more than 500 years after his final breath softened into silence, Leonardo da Vinci continues to teach without speaking. He teaches through the patience of his lines, through the restraint of his shadows, through the questions he left unfinished on purpose. His life does not end in a museum. It unfolds each time someone pauses long enough to truly see. And so, as the modern world rushes forward beneath skies filled with satellites and dreams that move faster than thought itself, Leonardo's presence lingers in the only place that has never changed. In the quiet space between observation and understanding. In the moment just before a question becomes an answer. In the breath before the world speaks back. And it is there, in that softened stillness, that the story of his genius gently waits for its next listener. The longer Leonardo's influence traveled, the more invisible it became. Like water that disappears into the roots of forests, his way of seeing no longer stood apart from the world. It fed it quietly from beneath. Many who practiced his patience never spoke his name at all. They simply lived differently. They moved more slowly. They looked more deeply. They created with gentler hands. These were not the people who filled headlines. They were the ones who stayed late after a lecture, still thinking. The ones who erased a drawing not in frustration, but in care. The ones who asked a single good question instead of many loud ones. They carried forward the unseen side of his legacy. In laboratories where machines listened to the faintest whispers of atoms, some scientists still kept small paper notebooks. They wrote slowly by hand. They sketched ideas instead of typing them. They paused after failures not to assign blame, but to sit with wonder. In these habits, seemingly outdated, stubbornly human, Leonardo breathed again. In hospitals that never truly slept, where beeping monitors marked the rhythm of fragile lives, there were moments when medicine, for all its precision, returned to something older than science. A nurse stayed at a bedside long after her shift had ended. A doctor closed his eyes briefly before speaking difficult words. A hand squeezed another hand in silence. These small acts of attention carried more healing than any instrument could measure. In crowded cities where light never dimmed and sound never rested, there were those who woke before sunrise just to watch the sky change. They did not photograph it. They did not share it. They simply stood still and let the color move across their faces. In those quiet minutes, the world became small again, and Leonardo, the lifelong watcher of transitions, felt near. Even in technology, where speed seemed to rule all things, his spirit worked in secret opposition. Designers began speaking not only about efficiency, but about elegance. Programmers spoke of machines that felt human not because they were faster, but because they were kinder. Engineers learned, slowly and imperfectly, that perfection does not live in excess, but in balance. These were his values: balanced tension, measured movement, resting points within motion. Leonardo had never chased the future. He had listened for it. And now, as the future thundered forward at a pace no single mind could hold, that listening became the only way to remain whole within it. Yet the world did not always choose this path. There were days of noise when gentleness felt like a luxury. There were ages of fear when patience felt like weakness. The same knowledge that healed carried new forms of harm. The same connection that brought people together also scattered them into endless comparison and quiet despair. In these moments, the distance between what humanity could do and what it knew how to hold grew painfully wide. And still, the soft answer remained the same. Look again. Listen longer. Do not be afraid of what you do not yet understand. Leonardo had trusted mystery more than certainty. That trust had made him patient enough to draw what no one else had thought to look for. And now, 5 centuries later, his example remained one of the final refuges from a world too eager to conclude. The greatest danger of speed is not error. It is forgetfulness. Forgetting how to observe. Forgetting how to wonder. Forgetting how to stand quietly inside a question without needing to own it. Leonardo had lived entirely within that space. He had walked through life not as a conqueror of secrets, but as their companion. He had let the world unfold itself slowly into his hands. And because of that, what he received had depth rather than dominance. This, perhaps, was the truest meaning of his genius. Not brilliance that burns, but attention that endures. As the modern age continues to stretch forward into unknown horizons, into worlds shaped by invisible code and distant stars, into futures no charcoal sketch could fully contain, the quiet question remains whether humanity will remember how to slow its own heartbeat enough to hear what still whispers beneath all that noise. Leonardo never offered a map. He offered a way of walking, with open eyes, with unhurried hands, with a heart willing to remain curious even at the edge of not knowing. And it is this way of walking that now passes, silently and patiently, from one generation to the next, often unnoticed, often unnamed, but never entirely lost, because the human soul, no matter how loud the world becomes, still aches for the same quiet meeting with truth that once held a solitary man in a Tuscan field, watching birds rise into morning light and wondering, gently, what it might feel like to follow. And somewhere, in the deep spaces where art and science still touch hands without fear, that wondering continues, not as a memory, as a living breath. And with that breath, the long arc of Leonardo's influence begins to bend once more, away from the echo of the past, and toward the story that has not yet learned its own name. There is a quiet moment that comes just before dawn, when the world seems to hold its breath. The sky is neither night nor morning. Birds have not yet begun their first uncertain songs. Even the wind feels as if it is waiting for permission to move. It is in this fragile in-between that the truest shape of Leonardo's legacy can still be felt. Not in the brightness of fame, not in the noise of achievement, but in the pause itself. Across the world, in countless small rooms, people wake before the day asks anything of them. Some are artists, some are scientists, some are neither. They sit with warm cups in their hands, staring out of windows without knowing why they feel the need to do so. Their minds wander without direction. Their thoughts drift. And in that drifting, something ancient stirs. A question without urgency. A curiosity without pressure. A quiet desire to understand without conquering. This is where Leonardo lives now. He lives in the child who takes apart a broken clock not to fix it, but to see how time hides inside metal. He lives in the student who stays after class not for praise, but because a single idea will not let go of their thoughts. He lives in the tired adult who picks up a pencil after many silent years and draws simply for the relief of watching a line come into existence. He lives in the deliberate breath taken before a difficult choice. In the softened voice used when a harder one would be easier. In the moment someone decides to look again when it would be simpler to turn away. Leonardo no longer belongs to history alone. He belongs to these moments. The strange truth is that the world he once studied has grown so vast, so complex, so impossibly fast, that his gentleness has become a form of quiet resistance. To observe slowly now is to stand against the current. To wonder without demand is to protect a fragile flame in a hard wind. And yet, again and again people choose it. Not loudly, not all at once, but in small, stubborn acts of attention. They sit with uncertainty instead of fleeing it. They listen instead of interrupting. They sketch instead of scrolling. They watch instead of racing. And each time they do, the long thread of Leonardo's life tightens ever so slightly, binding the present to a past that was never meant to be finished. For his work was never a conclusion. It was a conversation with water and wind, with muscle and bone, with shadow and light, with the silence that holds everything together. That conversation did not end when his breathing softened into stillness in a quiet French room. It simply changed voices, passed into thousands of hands, scattered into countless minds. It folded itself into the deep fabric of human becoming. And still it asks the same thing it always did. Will you look long enough to see? Will you listen quietly enough to be changed? The future, for all its speed and brilliance, still waits on the answer to those questions. Not from governments, not from machines, but from individuals one by one, choosing how to meet the world when no one is watching. Leonardo never taught humanity what to think. He taught it how to watch itself think. And in that watching, there remains the only doorway through which both wisdom and gentleness can still enter a restless age. As the story of his influence stretches beyond dates and disciplines, beyond frames and formulas, it begins to dissolve into something softer and more difficult to define. Not a legacy of things, but a legacy of attention. The kind that cannot be forced. The kind that cannot be owned. The kind that only survives when it is chosen again and again, quietly by ordinary people in ordinary moments. The long night of history continues to turn its pages. New wonders rise, new dangers shadow close behind them, and still, beneath every great leap forward, the same small heartbeat of wonder keeps time. It is the heartbeat of a man who once watched water drip from a leaf and felt no hurry to name what was happening. It is the heartbeat of a species still learning how to carry power without losing tenderness. It is the heartbeat of you, listening now, at the edge of sleep. And so, gently, without hurry, without finality, the story of Leonardo da Vinci does not close. It simply grows quiet enough for you to hear it inside your own breath. Would you like to continue into the final chapter, where this life of wonder completes its long human arc? There is a moment in every long story when movement slows, when the great turning of events settles into something smaller and closer to the heart. Leonardo's life had crossed cities and centuries, war and peace, brilliance and doubt. But its truest meaning was never in how far it traveled. It was in how deeply it listened. And now, as the world carries his echo forward, that listening becomes the final light he leaves behind. Leonardo had never tried to become immortal. He had only tried to be attentive. And perhaps that is why he still feels so near. Immortality built from stone eventually cracks. Immortality built from noise eventually fades. But attention, once learned, continues quietly from one soul to another like a flame passed carefully through darkness. It does not need a name. It does not need a monument. It only needs someone willing to pause. And even now, centuries later, the world pauses more often than it realizes. It pauses when someone stares at the night sky and forgets to check the time. It pauses when a hand rests on the glass of a window as rain moves downward in thin silver lines. It pauses when a child asks a question with no concern for whether it sounds clever. In these pauses, Leonardo still walks. Not as a figure in robes. Not as a legend of genius. But as a quiet permission to wonder without fear. The world he once knew has vanished. The fields of Vinci. The candlelit rooms of Florence. The quiet chambers of the French chateau where his breath finally grew still. All of it has dissolved into the long river of time. Yet the way he saw remains untouched by decay. Because ways of seeing do not depend on place. They depend on willingness. Leonardo had been willing to stay with a question longer than comfort allowed. He had been willing to accept not knowing as a companion rather than an enemy. He had been willing to love the world without demanding that it first make perfect sense. This is why his life still feels unfinished. Not because his work was left undone, but because his way of being was never meant to end. The greatest illusion of history is that influence moves only forward, that it belongs to the past and moves into the future in a straight line. But some lives do something stranger. They bend time inward. They make the future feel ancient and the past feel present. They turn distance into intimacy. Leonardo's life is one of those lives. When you watch light move across a wall at sunset and feel something unnamed shift inside you, he is there. When you draw a line not for perfection, but to understand what your hand is trying to say, he is there. When you stop to notice the way breath moves through your body without being asked, he is there. He is not watching from above. He is watching with you. This is the quiet truth that history often forgets. The greatest minds do not stand apart from humanity. They sink into it. They dissolve into the shared language of being alive. And in that dissolving, they become impossible to lose. Leonardo's genius was never a mountain rising above others. It was a river moving among them. A river that carried art and anatomy, motion and stillness, invention and restraint, all within the same gentle current. Anyone could stand at its edge. Anyone could kneel and touch the water. Anyone could drink. The only cost was patience. Now, the world stands at the edge of futures he could not have named. Worlds made of invisible connections and distant stars. Worlds shaped by choices arriving faster than reflection can always follow. And still, the old human questions remain unchanged beneath the glitter of possibility. How do we live without losing tenderness? How do we learn without forgetting wonder? How do we hold power without letting it harden our hands? Leonardo never answered these questions. He lived them. He answered them with waiting, with observing, with drawing what others hurried past. That is why, even now, his life feels more like an open door than a closed chapter. And so, as this long bedtime story comes gently to rest, nothing truly ends. The world still turns. Curiosity still trembles in quiet corners. Questions still rise without being summoned. Somewhere tonight, a hand will reach for a pencil. Somewhere a child will take apart a small, broken thing just to see what lives inside it. Somewhere a tired mind will soften at the sound of rain and feel, without knowing why, that it is being invited back into attention. Leonardo will be there, not in name, but in presence. And now, as your breathing slows and the edges of wakefulness grow soft, you carry this presence too, not as weight, not as expectation, but as permission. Permission to notice, permission to wonder, permission to rest inside the beauty of not fully knowing. The night does not ask you to solve it. It only asks you to enter quietly. And so, with Leonardo's long listening still echoing gently in the deep background of the world, this story closes not with certainty, but with calm. Not with answers, but with silence. A living silence. The kind that holds everything. Good.